Hello everyone. I just received an email and the topic is a colleague mixes his Nautilus at home using studio monitors and then has problems with his sound in the rehearsal room, specifically that he has too much bass. Today, I'd like to briefly talk with you about what's behind this and how we can avoid the whole issue. There are various reasons for this, and I don't just want to focus on studio monitors, but also on the headphones you might have at home or the in-ears, and then the PA in the rehearsal room and the PA at a gig. There are differences there as well. A studio monitor is supposed to sound very neutral. That means it has a flat frequency response, but it also has an advantage or disadvantage. It has relatively small speakers. For example, at home I have KRK VXT 6S. They have 6-inch speakers in them. You wouldn't even think about starting with something like that in a rehearsal room or on a big stage if you want to cover more than 200 people or actually even fewer with sound, at least not with just one speaker. Naturally, a smaller speaker simply has less bass than a larger speaker because a larger speaker can also make bigger excursions. So that's the first point. We have smaller speakers. This doesn't matter as much with headphones, for example, because you have them directly on your ears. You get a different sound anyway when they're closed back, but I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Then you're sitting relatively close to this speaker. Frequencies have the disadvantage or advantage, depending on how you look at it, that they have very long wavelengths. We're talking about the range from 20 to 60 Hertz, I would say. Actually, the crossover is usually set higher. You don't separate a top speaker and a subwoofer at 60 Hertz, but normally a bit higher. That also depends on the system, but the wavelength is of course much longer than, for example, a 500 Hertz or 2 kilohertz wave. That's the first point. The second point is that the frequency range of a studio monitor, headphones and a PA system are different. And most of the time in the studio or at home as a non-professional, you don't have a subwoofer. That means I really only have the small speakers, and in the rehearsal room I might already have a subwoofer, and on stage I definitely have subwoofers. So if I mix on small speakers at home so that they sound very bass heavy to me, which you shouldn't really do anyway with that much bass. So if you already mix a balanced sound at home, let's say you'll end up with more bass on the PA in the rehearsal room simply because that speaker naturally produces more bass. It just has more plain and simple. And if there's a subwoofer underneath, which can be adjusted independently in volume, it usually adds a bit more as well. And another thing, the PA isn't always completely linear. That also depends on how it's set up. And why is that? Now, of course, you might say, yeah, that would be awesome if that were the case, but that's not how it is. The same usually applies to headphones. They're much more linear than a PA, but even there are differences. That's simply because a studio monitor has a completely different job than a PA. Studio monitors, I connect them there. I'm trying to mix a nice sound for people who listen to music at home and on all sorts of devices, whether it's on the radio, on all those Apple Pod things, or on Alexa, or maybe you still have a nice hi-fi system at home. That's where it needs to sound good. And those systems also try to have a linear frequency response, but they still sound different. That's the job of a studio monitor. A PA system needs to be audible at high volumes. Not every last detail needs to be heard there. Of course, that also depends on the quality and price range of the PA, but first and foremost, it needs to sound loud, separate cleanly, and just work well in its respective area. And when it comes to bass, for example, if I'm outdoors or in a large hall with lots of people standing in front of the speakers, those bass frequencies disappear very quickly simply because they are absorbed by the legs of the people standing there or by the large space itself. And because of that, if I do a sound check in an empty room, for example, the bass will always be a bit more noticeable than it will be later when the room is full. That means the sound will end up being different again. An experienced PA or FOH mixer can compensate for that. They know this, they know their room, the conditions, their PA system, and are able to handle it. Or they just adjust the mix again during the first song as the room fills up. So what can we do about it? There are several options. The first option is to get to know your studio monitors and your rehearsal room PA. That's one approach. Then I know, okay, I've mixed it now. There's too much bass in the rehearsal room. Next time I'll just dial back the bass a bit, and then at home it might sound a little strange or a bit thin to my ears at first, but I know that it will fit in the rehearsal room. However, just because it works in the rehearsal room doesn't necessarily mean it will work on the PA outside. It will sound a bit different there as well. This is actually firstly a matter of experience, and you can counteract it by mixing your sounds evenly, not just in terms of volume, but also in terms of the frequency response you have in mind. Then the mixer at the front can use their equalizer, or you can as well, if you have a sub mixer with the master equalizer, in coordination with the PA person, with the FOH mixer, to make all sorts of adjustments. That means, for example, cutting frequencies in the bass, adding some in the highs, or whatever else you might need. If you've already balanced the sounds evenly, it will of course make things a whole lot easier for your colleague. So gaining experience is one thing. The second point is set up a subwoofer at home. Of course, you can always turn it up a bit louder. That means you can adjust it so that you get roughly the same bass feel as you do in the rehearsal room. However, this is also a matter of experience and will probably never sound exactly the same, but it's something you can do. Now, of course, you could also say, hey, I'll just set up a PA system at home. You can do that, but it also has the downside that a PA sounds different at low and high volumes, and the frequency response will also vary. The more expensive the setup, the smaller the difference will be, but it will always be there. So a quiet PA sounds different from a loud PA. Because of all the room reflections and the sensation you get in your ears, it's a solution, but not a perfect one. Of course, you could also just go to the rehearsal room to mix sound, but that will behave differently as well. For example, all the sound waves naturally overlap with each other. That means if I have a band, play alone at first, and then suddenly drums, bass, guitar, and vocals are added, the whole thing will sound different again. This isn't directly related to the original question, but it will also come together different. And the topic of keyboardists in a band in terms of frequency range is something I also wanted to address. I wanted to show a few images to illustrate where we fit in when it comes to assertiveness, because many keyboardists tend to just turn up the volume. We'll just turn it up louder. We'll layer another sound on top, which my colleague Thorsten has mentioned a few times as well. And then the sound just gets really fat, but that just fries everything as well. Nobody wants that, nobody likes it, and in the end, no one will thank you. Now, I've mentioned a few options to you. How do I do it? I actually learned to get to know my KRKs at home. I understood how they sound at home and how I sound out there, and that's why I don't have such big problems with it anymore. Besides that, I've gotten into the habit of generally not programming my sounds to be too bass heavy, or if I know they are too bass heavy, sometimes I just put in a simple low cut and just cut off the bottom end if I'm too lazy to do anything else. I've actually done that with pianos before too. If I know that I don't have my left hand under control or simply don't need to do anything else, then I can just keep playing there without any problems, because that really annoys me too. There's certain things I can only play with both hands, not just with my right, otherwise I get confused. That's definitely a really interesting topic. I'd also like to do something specifically on the topic of volume levels. I hope I was able to share something useful with you, and I'd appreciate a like and feel free to subscribe.